Welcome to Dialogue. Chinese authorities have recently condemned the U.S. for arranging the stopover of Taiwan leader Lai Ching-te in the U.S. state of Hawaii last weekend. The start of Lai's trip this week through the Pacific region of so-called diplomatic allies. The Chinese side reiterated that the Taiwan question is at the core of China's core interests and is the first red line that cannot be crossed in China-U.S. relations. What's Lai's trip really about, and what's his intention by having stopovers in U.S. territories? Why is the Taiwan question so sensitive in China-U.S. relationship? And what might be the policies of the new U.S. government regarding Taiwan? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Dr. Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies of the National Institute for Global Strategy, Benjamin Norton, Founder and Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, and Warwick Powell, a Senior Fellow at Taihe Institute. Welcome to the show. Zhao Hai, I will start with you. The Taiwan leader Lai Ching-te, as we said, he's known for being a politician who takes pride in being a, quote, practical worker of Taiwan independence. So his overseas trip is particularly, the stopovers in Hawaii and Guam, is with purpose probably to secede the territory, the island from China. What do you make of that?
I think, first of all, this particular trip shows that he's no longer a practical supporter of Taiwan independence. He's actually active advocating for Taiwan independence. He's decided that he's going to go down that path continuously by showing off that he could visit the remaining so-called states maintaining diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, and also he's showing that by stopping in Guam and Hawaii and also making phone calls with U.S. congressional leaders, he has bipartisan support from the United States. And he threw himself, particularly the current DPP government, into the so-called defense of the first island chain, which means that he actively involved Taiwan into the geopolitical competition between China and the United States. So at this point, I think he's basically trying to use the United States as a supporter, a backer of his agenda for more Taiwan, moving more towards Taiwan independence. And he's playing a very dangerous game here, even though with the recent military exercise of China around the island, and also China has, as you said, strongly protested and condemned such practice. He continued to do this, show that he has disregarded the peace and stability in the region. He is still trying to play his game and trying to involve the two biggest powers in the world. And I think this is, for the U.S. government, this is very dangerous. And at this particular moment, when one government transitions towards another, it's also a very vulnerable and sensitive timing. So I think at this point, this entire trip is highly alert for Chinese government and Chinese people.
Warwick, as Zhao has said, the timing is interesting. Of course, we see the Biden government is basically concluding, and Trump is yet to come back to the White House. And the timing of the trip, and also you see the telephone conversations, with U.S. There's the House Speaker, even Mike Johnson. We know that the U.S. one-China policy basically forbids or prevents U.S. having an official relationship with Taiwan. So, as Zhao Hai also said, it seems like both sides have something for themselves. Taiwan secessionist, that's the agenda, and the U.S. they can use Taiwan as a tool against China.
Absolutely, I think the timing is in large part about Lai Ching-te seeking to put some pressure on the incoming Trump administration as much as anything else, and to try to shape the context in which Trump's new administration takes shape over the course of the next 40 days or so before Inauguration Day. That's one point. The second point, of course, is that Lai has been a long-term advocate for Taiwanese independence and separatism and needs to ensure that he is able to demonstrate to his domestic support base that he is able to continue to prosecute this particular agenda. It is a very dangerous pathway to tread, in large part because I don't believe, firstly, that there is a groundswell of opinion on the island itself in relation to getting behind the separatist agenda. We know this because the election result did not deliver an overwhelming majority at all for Lai. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I actually doubt that the Americans actually want to see separatism get too far out of hand, because they know that that will create way too much trouble for what it's worth. What Washington would prefer, of course, is for Lai to be on a leash, but at the same time be able to adjust the temperature from time to time and ensure that there is a continued state of instability across the Straits and in the South China and East China Seas. And that situation suits Washington down to a T.
Ben, what do you make of the U.S. policy? You know, we do officially say they have the one China policy, acknowledging there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China, but at the same time, they do, continue to, for example, to sell weapons to the island. In recent times, twice actually. So, what's the real intention? Basically, Taiwan is a tool, given this worsening relationship between Beijing and Washington. So Taiwan is more outstanding in that kind of a tool, in the toolbox, let's say?
Yeah, well, what we can see is that the United States is using Taiwan to push the boundaries as it tries to essentially escalate in this kind of very aggressive foreign policy against mainland China. So we see that the U.S. at the same time has been expanding export controls, imposing sanctions, and now talking about tariffs. So there are different strategies that the United States is using. Taiwan is one of them. It's a very important one. And it's also very dangerous, of course, because this is actually violating in spirit the very foundation of U.S.-China relations. Let's not forget that in the 1970s and early 80s, the U.S. and China signed the 3 communiques that made it very clear that there is only one China. The United States recognized the one China policy. But what we have seen since then is a policy of strategic ambiguity. Go back to 1979, the year when the U.S. formally recognized the People's Republic of China, that same year, the U.S. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act that maintained continued weapon shipments to Taiwan. And what we've seen is that in 1982, the U.S. and China signed the 3rd communique, in which Washington pledged over time to stop sending weapons to Taiwan. They pledged in 1982 that they would not sell a higher level of weapons, a higher amount than they had previously sold. Well, the U.S. has been violating that pledge and selling more and more weapons to Taiwan, which is, again, part of this strategy of trying to push the boundaries in more and more openly support these extreme separatist movements in Taiwan, which, by the way, do not have the support of the people of Taiwan. Polls show that only around 8% of people support these extremist secessionist views. The vast majority of people in Taiwan do not support these views, but the U.S. is supporting these very extreme forces that are, again, trying to push the boundaries in order to turn up the diplomatic pressure on mainland China.
Thank you, Ben, for explaining the history and why Taiwan question is so sensitive in China-U.S. relationship. And Zhao Hai, while condemning the U.S. for arranging the stopovers, so-called for Lai Ching-te, Beijing also said, make it very clear. I would say reiterate the principle that Taiwan question is at the core of China's core interests and the first red line that cannot be crossed in China-U.S. relations. The Chinese side has been patient and repeating those lines. Tell us, how do you see this red line, this core of the core interest here?
Well, over time, China has told the U.S. that we have core interests that the U.S. should not touch or violate, which includes China's political institutions, China's sovereignty, and China's right to development. And at this particular time, China said that Taiwan is China's core of the core interests, meaning that we're elevating the Taiwan issue to the top of those core interests. And that's why I think China also reiterated that this is the first red line that should not be crossed. And China's sovereign issue is above all the most important, most most important thing that in Chinese people's mind and also for the Chinese leadership. So I think after last year's San Francisco meeting, and even before that, President Biden has promised China not to support Taiwan independence movement and also not to violate China's sovereignty. And at this, even though with continuous discussion about whether or not the U.S. should maintain strategic ambiguity, so far the U.S. has came out always saying that they will continue the one China policy. So if what they say and meet what they do, then of course there's no problem. But at this particular moment, as the previous speaker explained, the United States violate their own promise again and again, and they blame China for upsetting the status quo, which is really absurd. So I think the U.S. side from the Biden administration probably tried first to persuade Nancy Pelosi from visiting Taiwan, and then this time probably push Lai Ching-te further away to just visit those islands instead of visiting the U.S. mainland. But still, there are forces in the United States. Let's say not only there are extreme forces, secessionist or separatist forces on the island, but also there's those extreme politicians in the United States is not satisfied with the current playing of Taiwan cards. They want to play the card more often. And this is the time that they can use to show that they want to play the Taiwan card, showing their support, and the two parties actually competing for more tough stance against China by using this opportunity. So again, I think Taiwan people, again, is not deciding what should be best for the interest of the island and their people. Now this is the game of the politicians trying to garner attentions and also trying to play each other and showing which one is tougher on China and how to get upper hands on China. And moving forward, I think when the Trump administration came in, they will find themselves in a very difficult position, because if they don't follow the current suit, and they will see themselves as soften their position on China. If they go further down the path and get tougher, that means they will go toe-to-toe with China and perhaps going into even military conflict in the region.
Military conflict, Warwick, is that the consequence of crossing the line? Are people expecting or assuming that if the U.S., with the support of Taiwan and the authorities somehow cross that red line, what will happen?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that from the perspective of the People's Republic of China, and indeed from the perspective of those on the island, that there is one China. That's the first thing to remember, which means that from a sovereignty and a territorial point of view, the island is part and parcel of a much larger sovereign nation. Now, in an environment where there is a threat to that sovereignty from external forces, then it is quite reasonable for the government of that sovereign nation to exercise whatever actions it needs to exercise in a prudent way to protect its own sovereignty. Now, I don't believe that means that the People's Liberation Army would, quote, invade, unquote, Taiwan. Firstly, by definition, you can't invade your own country. But secondly, I don't believe that is a necessary part of the action that would be taken to protect the island and its sovereign status within the context of one China. What China has actually demonstrated over the last few years is its ability to rapidly circumnavigate the island and protect it from external interference. And there is no reason why that kind of approach would not be a reasonable response should sovereignty be threatened. Now, how external forces then respond to that will ultimately determine what happens next. And this is the dangerous point, because if external forces believe that they have a right to interfere in the sovereign issues of a sovereign country, then there will be trouble. And, let the world be warned that external provocateurs who are pushing this issue for their own geopolitical interests, and they have been doing this for 7 decades or more, are starting to jeopardize the pathways to peace, long-term peace and stability in the region. And that is not in the interests of both the peoples on both sides of the straits, let alone other parts of the region.
That's true. That's not only about China, but also about this larger regional peace and stability. Maybe for that purpose, the Chinese side has been, let's say, patient and also resorting to other measures to try to basically protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. We see that the Chinese side has been responding with the U.S. arms deal with some countermeasures, against the 13 U.S. military firms and the 6 senior executives of the I guess the companies involved in selling weapons to the Taiwan side. Warwick, what will be the impact? Some people would say, well, the question is China in the position to impose those measures. The measures will be biting, and then that will have an effect on those involved in supporting the secession moves in the island?
Look, the pursuit of public diplomacy, particularly at an international level, needs to be done in a judicious and careful manner. Now, these incremental responses are aimed at sending messages to other parties so that they can make better judgments about how to conduct their own business with the interests of broader regional stability in mind. Now, needless to say, the People's Republic of China is no doubt in a position to extend the scaffold of responses, and there is a long way to go. But the whole point of having modest responses that send clear messages is to avoid ratcheting up tensions and to create a pathway by which all parties involved can, in a sense, de-escalate so that some common ground can be formed or at least found, and which provides the basis for the re-establishment of regional security and stability. And that's why the responses have been incredibly calibrated and, relatively speaking, very, very modest. No doubt there are some people who would like to see much harsher, quicker, intense responses, but I think it is appropriate for responses to be pursued in a measured way that provides plenty of room for all concerned to get back to the table and to find the sensible pathway forward.
Well, Ben, speak of the arms sales to Taiwan. I think one international scholar half-jokingly said that, if the U.S. wants, really intends to see a real effect with arms sales to give Taiwan, they need to sell all the U.S. weapons to Taiwan to protect Taiwan, so-called protect Taiwan. But, it does not have the effect, it does not affect the situation, the real situation. But why keep on selling weapons to Taiwan?
Well, it's a political message, both to mainland China and the Taiwan authorities. It's an act of provocation against mainland China, which we see that the U.S. is fueling conflicts around the world because, unfortunately, U.S. foreign policy does not seek to resolve conflicts, but rather to exacerbate conflicts when politicians in Washington perceive them as serving U.S. interests. So by provoking mainland China, the U.S. wants some kind of response so then it can portray China supposedly as aggressive when obviously it's responding to U.S. aggression. The U.S. is the aggressor, but this is often how U.S. foreign policy works. It provokes a response, the other party responds, and then the U.S. points to that response. The U.S. media points to that response as supposed evidence of aggression, and then the U.S. continues moving up the escalation ladder. So this is part of the strategy. It's also a message to the authorities on Taiwan Island because, again, as I stressed, poll after poll over years has shown that the vast majority of people on Taiwan Island do not support this extreme secessionist movement, which, again, only has the support of around 8% of the population. The vast majority of people want to continue the status quo. They want to continue to improve relations with the mainland. So many people have family members and friends on both sides. They go across the Taiwan Strait for business, for studies, for work. So the U.S., by continuing to sell these weapons, continues to provoke the mainland to show these secessionist forces that the U.S. is supporting them and to exacerbate this conflict so it doesn't get better over time. Because from the perspective of some of these hawks in Washington, they can clearly see that over time, Taiwan and mainland China will grow closer and closer together. Economically, they will integrate more, and this is inevitable. So by continuing to provoke conflict, the U.S. seeks to prevent that inevitable reconciliation.
And I'm sure, some of the companies will make money out of that arms sales.
Well, of course, and they make money.
Yeah, continuously. And Ben, speak of that, with this continuous U.S. arms sale to Taiwan, it undermines, let's say, at least the trust, the confidence, for example, Beijing's confidence in the U.S. On one hand, you say you have one China policy. On the other hand, you are trying to sell arms to part of my territory to support the independence movement. Of course, I would question your sincerity in terms of your pledge, your promise to me of one China policy, right?
That's absolutely right. And this is also hurting the image of the United States around the world. We've seen, especially in recent years, that Washington has walked away from numerous binding agreements. Let's not forget what happened with Iran. The United States signed the JCPOA, a nuclear deal with Iran. And then there was a change of government, and the U.S. government under Trump withdrew and tore up that agreement. Now we see that the United States is violating the spirit of these very important agreements that the U.S. signed with the People's Republic of China in 1972, 1979, and 1982. These are the very foundations of U.S.-China relations. And by violating the spirit of that, not only is this causing significant damage to U.S.-China relations, it's showing many people around the world, countries, organizations, companies, that they have to have a second thought if they're going to work with the U.S. government, because the U.S. government can decide one day that it simply no longer wants to abide by its agreements. Or there could be a change in government from a Democrat to a Republican, and suddenly the U.S. violates these binding agreements, which is very irresponsible.
Zhao Hai, because the U.S. is going to have a new government, Trump is going to return to the White House. And of course, people pay close attention to, how his Taiwan policy will be, basically. In one interview, people talked about the final ultimate reunification across the straits, the island with the mainland there. And then what would he do? He said about more tariffs on the Chinese goods, which sounds very different from what Biden has said, sometimes intentionally or unintentionally. He talked about military defending Taiwan. What do you see, as the possible policies of the Trump government?
I have to separate Trump from Trump government. For Trump, he has said some things about Taiwan, like you said, either putting a tariff on China if China sort of using military against, if the mainland China used military against Taiwan, or he's talking about even punishing or destroying the TSMC, the company, for preventing that falling to the Chinese hands, or to force Taiwan to increase its military expenditure, buying more from the United States. So he has wild ideas about what to do with Taiwan from time to time, and he's not set. Focused on the strategic aspect of Taiwan. But many people believe that shows his business side of his character, because perhaps he could do a deal with China and selling Taiwan out. That's some of the Americans' doubts. But I think from a strategic community's perspective in the United States, they're basically saying that the Trump administration, particularly if you look at the candidates of the current cabinet, you will see that those people are very hawkish on China-U.S. relations, and they are very supportive of Taiwan, particularly for defense of Taiwan. So you just mentioned the selling of more weapons to Taiwan. I think there's another aspect to this, which means that previously they're just selling Taiwan, asking for a lot of money for those equipment that they know that Taiwan will use in a time of war. But this time they're selling a lot of practical weapon systems that could be used in the real war, and they are offering to train the Taiwan civilians to fight against the Chinese military. And their strategy is basically build Taiwan as a porcupine. It's called porcupine strategy, and also for the Taiwanese to defend the first wave of invasion and then wait for Americans and other allies to come to rescue. Those are kind of real plan. They're planning to fight a real war across the Taiwan Strait. So that's why I'm saying this is very dangerous, because they think they can use the military to resolve this issue rather than giving peace a chance for China to peacefully reunify and talk with the Taiwan Authority about peaceful reunification. So according to the China's anti-secession law, if there's no hope for peaceful reunification, China is justified to use force. So again, I think this kind of provocation, including continuous escalation of the tension and also elevating Taiwan's so-called diplomatic positions and increasing military, economic, all aspect of cooperation, official cooperation between the two sides is very dangerous. It's playing with fire.
Warwick, do you think the U.S. side is aware of how dangerous the situation could be, in particular for the Trump government? I mean, Zhao Hai made a good point. Trump and Trump government could be different there. And do you have concerns about the next 4 years over the Taiwan question?
Look, the Americans have a long track record of preferring kinetic interventions rather than mainstream peace-oriented diplomacy. Ever since the end of the Cold War, the United States has initiated on average 3.7 military interventions per year. This is form. The Americans in Washington, the neocons and the military-industrial complex prefer to pursue military actions in the face of potential disputations, and they certainly prefer to do it with other people's lives. And they've done this all across the world. The message that must be heeded is in Taipei and across the Taiwan island itself, and that is, don't think that American sincerity will go to a point where Americans will put Americans on the line for the lives of people on Taiwan. The Americans have shown time and time again that they will not do that. They will take people up the primrose path, they will throw them under the bus, and in fact we have seen in the last week Secretary of State Antony Blinken arguing for Ukrainians to conscript 18 to 25-year-olds. They don't care about the lives of other people. They only care about the geopolitical and financial interests of the United States. So this is a question of American insincerity, and that is why it's dangerous.
Ben, you were nodding your head, so I totally agree with what Warwick has said. The Secretary of State Clinton, he talked about urging the Ukrainians in 18 and above to join the army. So that could happen. I mean, that's really worse in terms of disrespect of human life there.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, as Warwick said, we've seen again and again in over decades with Democrats or Republicans in the White House that the U.S. has shown this willingness to, as they say, fight to the last Ukrainian or now potentially fight to the last Taiwanese, that the U.S. has used other territories in order to launch these kinds of conflicts against whom they perceive to be their geopolitical adversaries. And unfortunately, in Washington, if you listen to what people in think tanks are saying, more and more people are clamoring for some kind of military conflict. We even hear some very aggressive rhetoric from people in the Pentagon and the U.S. military. So I hope level heads will prevail. I hope there will not be some kind of conflict. But I think people in Taiwan very much need to realize that, as Warwick said, that if there is some kind of conflict, the United States is not supporting them out of benevolence. It's supporting them out of the realpolitik, and they're the ones who, unfortunately, will be suffering.
Yes. Well, with that, we are concluding today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.